The sun hung low over the dusty plains, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, as Amos, the giant cowboy, trudged along the trail with boots that left craters in the earth. His shadow stretched for miles, a towering silhouette that made even the cacti seem puny. Folks in the nearby town of Dust Whistle whispered about him, 7 feet tall, broad as a barn, with hands that could crush a boulder. Yet, his heart was softer than a prairie breeze. On this evening, as he hummed a lonesome tune, his sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement near a gnarled mesquite tree. A figure, small and frail, lay sprawled in the dirt, their wagon tipped over, its wheel shattered like a broken promise. The traveler, a young woman named Clara, clutched a tattered map, her face etched with desperation. Amos slowed his steps, mindful of the tremors his weight sent through the ground. "Do not mind my size, I will be very gentle," he called out, his voice deep but warm, like thunder wrapped in velvet. Clara froze, her eyes wide with fear, but Amos knelt slowly, his hat casting a shadow that shielded her from the fading sun. He saw her supplies scattered: a cans of beans, a cracked canteen, a locket clinging in the dust. "Looks like you're in a bind, miss," he said, his words measured to avoid startling her. Clara's hands trembled, but she nodded, too worried to run. Amos extended a hand, big enough to cradle her entire body, and waited. Trust was a fragile thing out here, and he'd learned long ago that his size could scare before his kindness could soothe. Gently, he righted the wagon with one hand, his muscles barely straining, while Claire watched, torn between awe and suspicion. He spoke of his life, how he'd been shunned for his stature but found purpose helping strays, human or otherwise. The desert was cruel, but Amos was not. Clara's fear began to ebb as he worked, his hands deft despite their enormity. By the time the stars emerged, the wagon stood steady, and Clara's breathing had calmed. Amos offered her his canteen, its size comical in her small hands, and she drank deeply. "I'm heading to Willow Creek," she said, her voice hoarse. "Got family there, if they're still alive." Amos nodded, his hat tipping slightly. "Reckon I'll see you there safe," he said, not a question but a promise. The night air grew cool, and Clara, though hesitant, felt the spark of hope. This giant, this stranger, was no ordinary man, and she sensed his words carried weight beyond his size. As they set off, the wagon creaking behind Amos's steady strides, Clara wondered if the tales of Dust Whistle's giant were less about fear and more about salvation. The journey to Willow Creek stretched across a merciless expanse of cracked earth and jagged hills, where the wind howled secrets older than the mountains. Amos led the way, his massive frame cutting through the dust storms like a ship through waves, while Clara clung to the wagon's reins, her eyes darting between the giant and the horizon. She'd heard tales of bandits, rattlers, and worsy things that lurked in the shadows of this untamed land. Yet Amos moved with a quiet confidence, his every step deliberate, as if the desert itself respected him. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to point out a hawk circling above or to warn of loose stones that might jolt the wagon. Clara, still wary, began to notice his carrier, how he'd pause to let her rest, or how he'd scoop sand from the path to ease the wagon's wheels. "Ain't right to let folks struggle alone," he said once, his eyes fixed on the stars. Clara learned his story in fragments. Born to a miner's family, too big even as a child, he'd been both a blessing and a burden, hauling loads no man could but scaring off numbers. He'd left home young, wandering the west, helping where he could. Clara shared her own tally, fleeing a city that chewed up dreamers, seeking kin in Willow Creek to start anew. The locket, she confessed, held a picture of her brother, lost to her years ago. Amos listened, his silence a kind of strength, and Clara felt her guard lower further. By the third day, they encountered trouble, a dry riverbed where the wagon's axle groaned under the strain. Amos knelt, inspecting it with hands that dwarfed the wood, and fashioned a brace from a fallen branch, his fingers working with the jeweler's precision. "Gentle's the only way to fix some things," he murmured, and Clara smiled for the first time. That night, around a small fire, she asked why he helped her, a stranger. Amos poked the flames, his face thoughtful. "World's big enough to break folks," he said. "If I can keep one from breaking, that's enough." The words settled over Clara like a warm blanket, and she slept soundly for the first time in weeks. As dawn broke, they pressed on, the silhouette of Willow Creek's hills faintly visible. But the desert wasn't done with them yet. A low rumble echoed, and Amos's eyes narrowed. Hoofbeats, bandits, likely, drawn by the wagon's meager cargo. Clara's heart raced, but Amos stood tall, his shadow a wall between her and danger. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Clara gripped her locket, praying this giant's gentleness could also mean strength. The hoofbeats grew louder, a thunderous drumroll against the parched earth, and Clara's pulse matched their rhythm as she peered from behind Amos's towering frame. 6 riders emerged from the haze, their faces masked by bandanas, eyes glending with greed. They circled the wagon, rifles gleaming under the noon sun. Their leader, a wiry man with a scar splitting his brow, spurring his horse forward. "Big fella, you got no business here," he sneered, eyeing Amos's size with a mix of bravado and unease. Clara clutched the wagon's edge, her knuckles white, but Amos stood unmoved, his hat low, casting a shadow that swallowed the leader's horse. "Ain't looking for trouble," Amos said, his voice steady as bedrock. "Just seeing this lady to Willow Creek." The bandits laughed, but it was a nervous sound, like coyotes testing a lion. The leader gestured to the wagon. "Hand over the goods, and maybe we let you walk." Clara's heart sank. Her supplies were all she had. But Amos stepped forward, his boots shaking the ground, and raised a hand, not in threat but in warning. "I said I'm gentle, not weak," he rumbled, and the air seemed to thicken. The bandits hesitated, their horses skittish, sensing something primal in Amos's presence. Clara watched, half expecting him to crush them like twigs, but instead, he spoke of reason, how fighting would cost them more than stealing. The leader scoffed, cocking his rifle, but Amos moved faster than his size suggested, disarming him with a flick of his wrist, the gun landing in the dust. The other bandits froze, their bravado crumbling. Amos didn't raise a fist. He didn't need to. His sheer presence, a mountain of calm resolve, made them rethink their odds. "Go home," he said, tossing the rifle back to the leader, who caught it with trembling hands. One by one, the bandits retreated, their hoofbeats fading into the wind. Clara exhaled, her fear giving way to awe. "How'd you do that without a fight?" she asked. Amos shrugged, dusting his hands. "Most folks just need to know you ain't scared." They continued on, the wagon creaking as the hills of Willow Creek grew closer, and Clara began to see Amos not just as a giant, but as a force of nature. Gentle, yes, but unyielding when it mattered. As the days blurred into a rhythm of dust and determination, Clara found herself watching Amos more closely, noting the small acts that defined him. He'd lift the wagon over rocky patches without a grunt, carve paths through thorny scrub with a flick of his machete, or share his meager rations when her own ran low. His hands, capable of snapping trees, handled her locket with care when she dropped it, returning it with a nod. "Family's worth more than gold," he said, and Clara's throat tightened, thinking of her brother. The desert tested Amos. Blazing days, freezing nights, and once, a rattler that Amos scooped up and tossed away before it could strike. Clara began to talk more, sharing stories of her childhood, of city lights and broken dreams, and Amos listened, his silence a canvas for her words. He spoke less, but when he did, it was with purpose. Tales of towns he'd passed through, folks he'd helped, and the loneliness of being too big for the world to hold. "Ever think of settling down?" Clara asked one night, the firelight dancing on his weathered face. Amos chuckled, a sound like rolling boulders. "Ain't many places built for me." But his eyes lingered on the stars, and Clara sensed a longing he'd never voice. By the 5th day, Willow Creek's outline sharpened at a cluster of wooden shacks nestled in a valley. Clara's hope surged, but so did her fear. What if her family was gone? Amos seemed to sense her unease, offering a smile that softened his giant features. "We'll find AM," he said, and she believed him. That evening, a storm rolled in, the sky splitting with lightning. The wagon's tarp tore, and rain soaked Clara's supplies. Amos worked through the downpour, his massive hands patching the tarp with scraps of leather, his hat shielding Clara from the worst of it. "Ain't letting a little rain stop us," he said, and Clara laughed, a sound that surprised her. The storm passed, leaving a sky full of stars, and Clara felt a shift as she trusted Amos, not just as a protector, but as a friend. As they neared Willow Creek, the trail grew busier, with traders and settlers eyeing Amos warily. He ignored their stares, focused on Clara's goal. "You're a good man, Amos," she said softly. He tipped his hat, his eyes warm. "Just doing what's right, miss." But Clara knew it was more than that. Amos carried the weight of the world's fears, yet chose to be its shelter. The outskirts of Willow Creek buzzed with life via merchants haggling, children darting through muddy streets, and the clatter of saloon doors swinging wide. Clara's heart raced as she scanned the faces, searching for her brother's familiar features, while Amos loomed beside her, his presence parting the crowd like a river around a boulder. Folks whispered, pointing at the giant cowboy, but he kept his eyes forward, guiding the wagon to a stable where Clara could rest her horse. The stable master, a grizzled man with a limp, eyed Amos suspiciously but softened when Clara explained their journey. "He's the reason I'm here," she said, and Amos shifted, uncomfortable with praise. They learned Willow Creek was a town of second chances, where drifters and dreamers carved out new lives. Clara's hope flickered her brother might still be here. At the town hall, she pored over records, Amos standing guard outside, his shadow cooling the porch. The clerk, a nervous woman with ink-stained fingers, found no trace of Clara's brother, but suggested checking the old mining camps nearby. Clara's shoulders sagged, but Amos placed a hand on the wagon, gentle as ever. "We ain't done yet," he said, and she drew strength from his resolve. They set out for the camps, a maze of abandoned shafts and shacks where prospectors still chased fading dreams. The trail was treacherous, littered with loose rocks and old dynamite crates, but Amos cleared the way, his strength turning obstacles to dust. At the first camp, they found only ghosts, empty tents and rusted tools, but at the second, a grizzled miner recognized Clara's locket. "Saw a fella with one like that," he said, pointing to a distant ridge. Clara's heart leapt, but the miner warned of claim jumpers who prowled the hills, armed and ruthless. Amos's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "They won't bother us," he said, and Clara believed him. As night fell, they camped near the ridge, the air thick with the scent of pine and danger. Amos built a fire, his hand steady despite the cold, and Clara shared her last biscuit with him, a small gesture that felt like trust. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked again, her voice soft. Amos stared into the flames. "Some folks need a hand, and I got plenty to spare." Clara smiled, realizing his size wasn't just a burden up, it was his gift to the world. Dawn broke over the ridge, casting long shadows that danced across the rocky slopes. Clara clutched her locket, her hope now a fragile thread as she and Amos trekked toward the miner's tip. The path was steep, forcing Clara to lean on the wagon while Amos carried it over the worst patches, his strength a quiet marvel. They reached a cluster of shacks, the roofs sagging under years of neglect, and Clara called her brother's name, Elijah, her voice echoing off the cliffs. No answer came, but the rustle in the brush made Amos pause, his hand resting on the machete at his belt. 3 figures emerged, claim jumpers with gaunt faces and loaded rifles, their eyes gleaming with greed. "That's a fine wagon," one growled, aiming at Clara. Amos stepped forward, his shadow swallowing them. "Walk away," he said, his voice slow but firm, like a storm held back. The jumpers hesitated, their bravado faltering under Amos's gaze, but the leader fired a warning shot, kicking up dust at Clara's feet. She flinched, but Amos didn't. With a single stride, he closed the distance, wrenching the rifle from the leader's hands and snapping it like a twig. The others dropped their weapons, fleeing into the hills, their curses fading with their footsteps. Clara's knees shook, but Amos's hand on her shoulder steadied her. "You're safe," he said, and she nodded, breathless. They searched the shacks, finding traces of life via worn boots, a half-eaten meal, but no Elijah. Clara's hope waned until Amos spotted a carving on a beam, her brother's initials, scratched beside a date from last month. "He's close," Amos said, and Clara clung to that spark. They pressed on, following a faint trail to a hidden cave where a lone figure sat by a fire. It was Elijah, thinner and wearier than Clara remembered, but alive. She ran to him, tears streaming. and Amos stood back, his giant frame a silent sentinel. Elijah, wary at first, softened when Clara explained Amos's role. "You're a rare kind, mister," he said, shaking Amos's massive hand. The siblings reunited, sharing stories of loss and survival, while Amos tended the fire, his presence a quiet anchor. As they prepared to return to Willow Creek, Elijah offered Amos a share of his meager claim. Amos declined, his smile gentle. "Just see to your sister," he said. "That's payment enough." The return to Willow Creek felt lighter, the wagon now carrying Elijah's gear alongside Clara's hopes. Amos led the way, his stride steady, while the siblings walked arm in arm, their laughter a rare sound in the desert's silence. The town welcomed them with curious stares, but Amos's presence kept questions at bay. At the saloon, Clara and Elijah shared the meal, insisting Amos join them. He sat awkwardly, his knees bumping the table, but his smile was genuine as he listened to their plans a small farm. A new start. Clara noticed how folks watched Amos, some with fear, others with gratitude, for tales of his deeds had spread. A child tugged at his sleeve, offering a daisy, and Amos accepted it, tucking it into his hat band with care. "You're Mac and friends," Clara teased, and Amos chuckled, his laugh shaking the floor. As days passed, Clara and Elijah settled into Willow Creek, their bond mending with every shared task. Amos stayed on, helping rebuild a barn or haul supplies, his strength a boon to the town. Yet Clara sensed a restlessness in him, a wanderer's heart beneath his gentle exterior. One evening, as they sat by the town's well, she asked, "Where'll you go next?" Amos looked to the horizon, where the sun bled into the hills. "Wherever folks need a hand," he said. Clara felt a pang, knowing he'd leave soon, but also pride in the difference he'd made. She gave him her locket, now empty, as a keepsake. "So you remember us," she said. Amos held it delicately, his eyes soft. "Ain't likely to forget," he replied. The next morning, he was gone, his tracks leading west, deep and wide in the dust. Clara and Elijah stood at the town's edge, watching the horizon swallow his shadow. Stories of the giant cowboy spread, growing taller with each telling, but Clara knew the truth. Amos was no myth, but a man whose size matched his heart, gentle and unyielding, a beacon for the struggling. Months later, Willow Creek thrived, its streets busier, its people bolder, as if Amos's brief presence had left a spark. Clara and Elijah's farm took root, their fields green with promise, and the locket's absence on Clara's neck felt like a badge of gratitude. Word of Amos drifted back at tales of a giant saving a stranded family in Redstone, or clearing a rockslide in Copper Valley. Each story painted him the same, towering, gentle, and gone before thanks could weigh him down. Clara often sat by the well, tracing the memory of his voice, those words that had steadied her. "Do not mind my size, I will be very gentle." She wondered where he was, if the desert's loneliness ever wore on him, but she knew he'd keep moving, helping others as he'd helped her. In Willow Creek, folks began to call him the Gentle Giant, a name that stuck like dust to boots. Clara and Elijah shared their story with newcomers, ensuring Amos's kindness lived on. One day, a trader brought news of a giant cowboy seen near the border, aiding a caravan caught in a flash flood. Clara smiled, imagining Amos's hands lifting wagons from the mud, his voice calming frightened souls. She and Elijah vowed to pay his kindness forward, helping strangers who passed through, offering food or shelter. The town, once wary of outsiders, grew warmer, as if Amos's spirit lingered in its streets. Clara kept a journal, writing down every tale of Amos she heard, a patchwork of his wanderings. She hoped one day he'd return, if only to see the lives he'd touched. But deep down, she knew Amos belonged to the wild, to the open trails where the struggling waited. As seasons turned, Willow Creek's children played games of the giant cowboy, mimicking his slow strides and deep voice. Clara watched, her heart full, knowing Amos had given her more than safety. He'd shown her the power of trust, of gentleness in a harsh world. Somewhere, under the same vast sky, Amos walked on, his shadow a promise that no one struggled alone.